the brink of extinction. The war was lost. The Galactic Coalition had once been a mighty force, a union of dozens of advanced species that believed in peace, trade, and diplomacy. But peace meant nothing to the Xel'nari. The war-hungry empire had swept across the stars, conquering and exterminating all in its path. The Coalition's fleets had been shattered. Their armies had been routed. Entire worlds had been burned to ash. Now, the last remnants of the Coalition's leadership sat in the dimly lit war chamber aboard the Deliverance, a failing dreadnought drifting in deep space. The air was thick with the scent of defeat. Gentlemen, ladies, whatever we are calling ourselves these days, Admiral Varesh of the Xel'nari side, rubbing his 4 eyes. His people, once proud warriors, have been broken. It's over. We cannot defeat the Xel'nari. Surrender may be our only option. A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. Even the Zorak, whose reptilian kind had fought to the bitter end on a dozen worlds, seemed resigned to their fate. Only one among them remained silent. Ambassador Renal of the Xel'nari, one of the oldest species in the Coalition, sat with his tendrils folded. He had spent centuries negotiating treaties, de-escalating wars. But now, diplomacy was useless. There is one last option, Renal finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. A species we once dismissed, one we deemed too violent, too unpredictable. We never invited them into the Coalition, fearing what they might become. He paused, his dark eyes scanning the gathered leaders. I speak of humanity. Silence. The name was barely known to most of the leaders in the chamber. Humanity was a minor species, confined to a single world on the fringes of Coalition space. They had never been part of interstellar politics, never contributed to great scientific advancements. And yet, the humans, scoffed Admiral Varesh. Primitive savages. They war with each other more than any species I've ever seen. Yes, Renal agreed. And yet they win. Every time, against impossible odds, against greater forces, they survive. A holographic display flickered to life in the center of the room. Footage from human history played. Ancient wars, brutal conflicts, overwhelming odds. The humans fought with strategy, with determination, and above all, with an unbreakable will. They are warriors by nature, Renal continued. Where we hesitate, they strike. Where we falter, they endure. We fear battle. They thrive in it. A heavy silence followed his words. The Coalition had always believed in fighting honorably, strategically, but the Xel'nari did not fight fair. They waged total war, and if the Coalition wanted to survive, they needed something more than strategy. They needed ruthlessness. Varesh leaned forward, his mandibles clicking in thought. And what makes you think they'll help us? We left them out of the Coalition. We never even considered them worth allying with. Renal's tendrils twitched, his version of smile. Because humans don't just fight for honor or duty. They fight for survival. And if we offer them a war worth winning, they'll take it. Another voice, deep and growling, rumbled through the chamber. General Karan of the Zorak, the last true warrior among them, leaned forward. Then we go to Earth. A decision was made. First contact. 2 days later, a battered Coalition scout ship emerged from slipspace above Earth. The human homeworld was unlike any planet they had seen. Its skies were stained with the remnants of past wars, its landscapes carved by both nature and conflict. And yet it thrived. Even from orbit, the energy of the species below was unmistakable. The humans were survivors. The transmission was sent. A simple message. To the leaders of Earth, the Galactic Coalition seeks an alliance. The fate of the galaxy depends on your answer. There was no reply for several hours. Then, a response. A single line, short but chilling. Send your delegates. And be prepared to explain why you waited so long to ask. Humanity's bloody reputation. The Coalition had expected Earth to be a backwater world, a primitive and fractured planet barely capable of interstellar travel. They had been wrong. The moment the delegation landed, they were greeted not by weak diplomats, but by soldiers. Hardened men and women in rigid uniforms, their eyes scanning every movement. The atmosphere was tense, not with fear, but with discipline. These are not bureaucrats debating peace. These were warriors accustomed to war. Rinal, representing the Galactic Coalition, stepped forward. The human delegation met him with cold, appraising eyes. At their center stood General Elias Ward, Supreme Commander of Earth's Defense Forces. "You waited until the war was lost," Ward said, his voice steady, unreadable. "Why?" The coalition leaders hesitated. How could they admit the truth? That they had feared humanity's brutality? That they had dismissed them as dangerous? Rinal chose his words carefully. "We underestimated you." Ward's lips curled slightly, something between amusement and disdain. "Yes, you did." The humans led them inside, into a room filled with military advisors and holographic displays. A war room. The coalition representatives barely had time to settle before Ward gestured to a technician. "Show them," he ordered. The room darkened, and a massive screen lit up with a display of the Xel'nari war front. But it was not the usual grim statistics of losses and retreats. This was an analysis, one that tore apart the Xel'nari's war machine with cold precision. "We intercepted your transmissions and studied the enemy," Ward explained. "We already know how they fight. More importantly, we know how to break them." The coalition members sat in stunned silence. The humans had been monitoring the war, studying it. They weren't just reacting, they were preparing. Varesh, the Xel'nari admiral, leaned forward. "How would you do it?" Ward's expression didn't change. "We won't fight like you." A flick of his hand, and the screen shifted. It displayed human wars, conflicts from their own history, battles against impossible odds, tactics no coalition species would ever consider. Guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, shock tactics, Ward continued. "We don't need to match them in numbers. We just need to make them bleed until they break." Rinal frowned. "You would resort to such brutality?" Ward's gaze hardened. "The Xel'nari burned your worlds. They slaughtered your civilians. And you still think there's a right way to fight them?" A silence stretched between them. It was true. The coalition had fought honorably, strategically, and they had lost. The Xel'nari had no mercy. Why should humanity? General Karan of the Zorak, always the warrior among them, rumbled with approval. "They fight like my ancestors did, with fire and blood." He turned to Ward. "What do you need?" Ward exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the table. "Authority. We won't just advise. We lead. No interference. No hesitation." His voice grew sharper. "And when we say an order, you follow it." The coalition members exchanged uneasy glances. Could they trust humanity with this power? Could they allow an unchained species to lead the war? But what choice did they have? Rinal nodded. "You will have your authority." Ward gave a slow nod in return. "Then let's get to work." The war had just changed. The unstoppable counterattack. The first human-led assault was nothing like the coalition had ever seen. For years, the Xel'nari had fought with overwhelming force, their fleets crushing all resistance through sheer firepower. The coalition had tried to match them with strategy and discipline. It had failed. Humanity had no such illusions. They didn't fight fair. Operation Scorched Talon. The target was Horva's Prime, a once-thriving coalition world that had fallen months ago. Now, it was a heavily fortified Xel'nari command post, its skies swarming with enemy patrols, its surface a maze of military outposts. The coalition would have launched a direct assault, storming the planet, meeting the Xel'nari head-on. It would have been another massacre. The humans did something else entirely. It started with silence. For 3 days, nothing happened. No movement. No attacks. The Xel'nari commanders grew restless, their patrols doubling. They knew the enemy was out there, but where? Then the first blow landed. A Xel'nari supply depot exploded in a flash of fire and shrapnel. An hour later, a communications hub went dark. Before the Xel'nari could even process what was happening, their entire planetary defense network began collapsing piece by piece. Sabotage, precision strikes, psychological warfare. The humans had infiltrated the planet before the battle even began. Sleeper cells, small, highly trained strike teams, had embedded themselves behind enemy lines. They spread misinformation, turned minor skirmishes into full-blown panics, and executed key targets with terrifying efficiency. And when the real assault finally came, the Xel'nari were already broken. The human way of war. Coalition forces, now under human command, struck with a speed and brutality they had never attempted before. Dropships didn't land in neat formations. They crashed into enemy bases, deploying shock troops who fought with terrifying aggression. Xel'nari commanders, trained to expect careful, calculated tactics, were overwhelmed by human unpredictability. One moment, their forces were pushing forward. The next, they were ambushed from three sides. The battlefield shifted too fast for them to react. Varesh watched the carnage unfold from orbit, his 4 eyes wide. "This isn't war," he muttered. "This is annihilation." Beside him, General Ward stood with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "War is won by breaking the enemy's will," he said, "not just their bodies." On the ground, Xel'nari soldiers, once feared across the galaxy, began surrendering en masse. Not because they lacked weapons, not because they lacked orders, but because they had never faced an enemy so relentless. By the time the last Xel'nari stronghold fell, the battle was over. Horva's Prime had been reclaimed, a message to the enemy. As the dust settled, a single Xel'nari commander was allowed to live. He was sent back to his people, carrying a simple message from humanity. This was mercy. Next time, we won't be so kind. The war had turned, and the galaxy would never be the same. The fall of the Xel'nari Empire. The war had changed. The Xel'nari, once an unstoppable force, were now the ones on the defensive. The relentless human-led assaults had shattered their strategies, disrupted their supply lines, and broken their will to fight. Coalition forces, once demoralized and fractured, now fought with new purpose. World after world fell back into Coalition hands. The Xel'nari had never faced an enemy that fought like humanity, ruthless, unpredictable, and utterly relentless. And now, the war had reached its final stage. The siege of Zelrath. The Xel'nari homeworld, Zelrath, was a fortress, heavily defended, surrounded by a fleet that had once been the pride of their empire. It was the last unbroken stronghold. If it fell, the war was over. The Coalition's old leadership would have hesitated, would have debated the morality of such an attack. Humanity did not. General Elias Ward stood before the assembled fleet, his voice calm and absolute. "This ends today." The attack was swift, brutal, and unlike anything the Xel'nari had prepared for. Instead of a direct assault, the humans turned their own strategies against them. They had studied Xel'nari doctrine, understood their weaknesses, and exploited them without mercy. First, cyber warfare teams crippled planetary defenses, shutting down key systems. False transmissions tricked Xel'nari commanders into deploying their forces in the wrong locations. Then the bombardment began, not just on military targets, but on the very infrastructure that sustained the Xel'nari war machine. For the first time in their history, the Xel'nari knew fear. The last stand. On the surface of Zelrath, the Xel'nari High Command made their final stand. Trained from birth to believe in their own superiority, they had never considered the possibility of defeat. And yet, here they were, surrounded, their cities in flames, their forces crumbling. Human-led shock troops stormed their citadel, advancing through the ruins with ruthless efficiency. The Xel'nari fought desperately, but their once unshakable discipline was gone. They were not just losing a war, they were losing everything. At the center of the chaos, Ward and his forces reached the heart of the Xel'nari leadership. A desperate transmission was broadcast across the battlefield. "We surrender." The words echoed across the remains of their empire. For a moment, silence hung over the battlefield. The once mighty Xel'nari were kneeling before a species they had once ignored. Ward stepped forward, his face unreadable. "You don't get to surrender. There will be no peace treaty, no negotiations, no escape." The Xel'nari Empire, the architects of genocide, the conquerors of countless worlds, was wiped from existence. A new order. Days later, the war was officially over. The Coalition stood victorious, But something had changed. The old ways of war, of diplomacy, of careful strategy had been replaced by something else. Something colder, more decisive. In the Coalition High Council, the remaining leaders gathered to discuss the future. The room was filled with voices, concerns, and whispered fears. Then Ward entered, and the room fell silent. He looked at the assembled leaders, his expression unreadable. "This is what happens when you hesitate," he said, voice calm, steady. "Next time, call us sooner." No one argued. The war had been lost,